Well, good afternoon. So glad that you're all here to join us. I'm Pastor Deb. I'm the Associate Pastor of Discipleship here at St. Mark's, and it is an honor to welcome all of you here this morning. It's usually morning when I'm standing up here. This afternoon. Let's begin with a word of prayer. God of all places and people, we give thanks for this gathering. We give thanks that Charles is here to help us better understand your people and your place. Bless all these words, our conversations, so that we might leave this place with a greater understanding. In your name we pray. Amen. So I would like to introduce to you Charles Weiss. He has served as the founding director of the John Glenn School of Public Affairs of The Ohio State University. He is currently Professor Emeritus in the John Glenn College and teaching in the college's Washington Master of Public Affairs program. He is also serving on the college's Board of Visitors. Prior to his service at Ohio State, he was Associate Dean of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs of Indiana University. He also served as the director of the Parliamentary Development Project for Ukraine, which was headquartered in Ohio State. This program aided the Ukrainian parliament to develop into stronger and more democratic representative institution. He also served in the United States Department of Justice, first as a special assistant for policy analysis, and then as the first director of intergovernmental affairs for the department. Charles was elected president of the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration and was selected as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. His research was awarded the Mosier Award for Best Academic Article for the year published in the Public Administrative Review 3 times. He's also served as the managing editor of the Public Administrative Review, Public Administration's leading journal. His latest book, The Courts and the President, Judicial Review of Presidential Directed Action, was published in 2024. And more locally, we are so honored that Charles is also the chair of St. Mark's Worldwide Christian Support Task Force. Charles, I'll turn it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Deborah. Well, welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming to learn more about Ukraine. I've been involved with that a long time, so it's kind of close to my heart. We'd like to welcome you on behalf of St. Mark's Worldwide Christian Support Task Force. And Ukraine needs a lot of support at this point. What I'm going to talk about, the overview, is that first I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became involved with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian parliament. Then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges the Ukrainian people and their leaders have had to face to establish Ukraine and establish its government and their democracy, and also how they've handled these challenges. Then I'm going to talk about the effect of the war on the ability of Ukraine's democratic institutions to function and also to respond to the war. So that's sort of the overview here. First of all, my experience with Ukraine. One of the things that happened, you may recall, is that the Soviet Union under President Gorbachev started introducing some reforms called glasnost and perestroika, which allowed for the first elections in the Soviet republics, the first elections for their republic parliaments, still part of the Soviet Union, but to have actual elections. Prior to that, only Communist Party members could be part of the Soviets. And that meant that there was really no deliberation and no policy making. They were really a rubber stamp for the regime. Under perestroika, there were elections, and for the first time, non-communists got elected, democratic forces. And they came to Parliament, and some of them called up people they knew in the United States, Ukrainians, Americans, and said to them, guess what? We got elected to the Parliament. What do you do in a Parliament? Now, that may sound strange to you, but Americans, I've come to learn, really have not really comprehended how effective the Soviet state was. The Soviet state was not effective in a lot of things, failure economically, for one thing, but they were very effective in sealing off they're citizens of the Soviet Union, for any information about how Western governments operated, what they were, what democracy was, or anything. Totally sealed off. Even the elites in the republics could not get such information. So my friends asked me if I could help with providing some kind of an educational program for these newly elected parliamentarians. And so I got a grant from the United States Information Service to bring a delegation from the Republic, still part of the Soviet Union Parliament, to the United States, to Washington and Indiana. I was on the faculty in Indiana at the time, for a 2-week program on how our government operated and what the principles of democracy were. And that delegation was made up of members across the political spectrum in Ukraine. One was the deputy chairman of the parliament, who had been the deputy chairman of the Communist Party, another prominent communist member, but also many Democrats, some of whom had served time in Soviet prisons for writing and for speaking. So they came, and I have to tell you, I have never seen such dedicated, intense students in my life. I mean, we had many sessions for them, and we had to keep dragging them out to go to the next session because they had so many questions and everything. They were intensely interested, and I can in part understand why. Even the leader, the deputy chairman of the parliament who was in that delegation, he said to me at one break, speaking of the Soviet leadership, we knew that they were lying to us. We just didn't know how much. And so they were intensely interested in this. And then that led to 3 more of such study visits, at which point the leadership, and at this point the guy, Ivan Plush, who had been in the first delegation, was now had been chairman of the parliament. And he asked us to provide a more hands-on experience with more technical assistance in the country. At which point I went to the United States Agency for International Development and got a 5-year grant for providing this kind of assistance. And we had an office in Kyiv. We had an office back in Indiana, then Ohio State when I moved over there to provide research support for this kind of thing. And for 19 years, we worked with the Parliament, and so that's where I'm coming from in terms of my perspective in working with these people as they confronted the challenges. And there were a lot of challenges. Unlike the Baltic states that came out of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European students who broke away from the Soviet Union, Ukraine had no prior independence, only really 2 years in the 20s, and no experience at all with their own government. Think about that. Since the beginning of time, they'd been somebody's colony. So they had no basis for which to operate a government, let alone develop one. And so they had to build from scratch. And at the same time, the economy, the Soviet economy collapsed, and they had to build a new economy at the same time. And they were dealing with a society that had no experience with democratic government and all the principles that we take for granted, like free speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion and all this kind of thing. So it was quite a challenge, and they had to reorient their people, to acclimate those people to new systems as they were being developed. And so birth and growing pains were going to be experienced, and they were. And in the Republic Parliament, which had previously been under control only of the Communist Party, that began to change. And first, it was a change from the Ukrainian, from the Supreme Soviet, which they called it, to the Parliament of Ukraine. And the Communist Party was reduced to 239 members from 450. So for the first time, Ukraine actually had real debates and competition over policy. But they had to create everything in the parliament. The previous Soviet parliament had none of the functions that you're used to seeing in a parliament or in a legislature. So here's some of the things that we were working on with them that they had to develop. The budget process. In Soviet times, they had no budget process. You know, they just did whatever the top told people to spend money on. That was it. There was nothing like we have where Congress, you know, considers proposals for budgets, adopts a budget, passes a budget, the president signs. They had none of that. There was, if you'll excuse me just a second. The committee structure in operations. They appointed committees, but what were they going to do? How would they consider bills? How would they get input from constituencies? How would they conduct hearings? All those kinds of things. So we worked with them on that. Constituency relations. You know, in the communist system, you didn't ask the people what they wanted. You told the people what they were going to do. In this system, the representatives were expected to ask the people what they wanted and help them with their problems. So we developed procedures and processes for them to help them with that. Oversight of the executive bodies. Again, top-down was the Soviet system. In this system, you have a separation of powers. The parliament had a responsibility to question and oversee what the executive was doing. But they had no procedures. They had no processes. So we helped them develop those as well. Then the legal structure for regional and local governments. Part of democratization is developing autonomy for regional and local governments and their local democracies. They had no basis for that. So we helped them with that. And then the election structure and the regulations for it. You know, there was no such thing as free elections under the Soviet system. So they had no experience with how you set up a structure and particularly have the regulations to make for free and open elections. And so that was a preoccupation. Now, question, was there real democracy going on? Well, here is a list of the presidents of Ukraine, all elected. And you'll note that the ones with the sign there, these were all presidents who were elected but then not reelected. And one of the key principles of democracy is that there can be a turnover in the regime. And as Ukraine has demonstrated here, that has happened several times. The idea, obviously basic democratic idea, is that an incumbent president gets a chance, but if the people were dissatisfied, they can turn them out at the ballot box. Well, people in Ukraine have done that. And so I think they have demonstrated one of the key characteristics of democracy, which is an exception in the post-Soviet countries. Most of the other, not again the Baltics accepted, but most of the other ones, what you saw was a leader come to the fore, usually the previous head of the Communist Party in that country, installed themselves as the head of the country and haven't left. That is not the case in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that it's all been roses for Ukraine, not by any means. Ukraine has had to face major challenges and crises. starting with gaining of independence. When Glasnost happened and they allowed this first loosening in the republics, the purpose of that for Gorbachev was to reform the communist system, but to keep the communist system in place and to keep the Soviet Union together. That was his objective. What to do? Well, what happened was there was a coup in August of 1991 by hardliners in the Soviet security services and in the army who disagreed with loosening in the Glasnost. And they tried to displace Gorbachev, imprisoned him in his vacation home for a while, but it didn't work. People came out of the streets in Moscow, and Yeltsin got up on a tank, and soon the security services collapsed. But that shook all the people in the republics that the Soviet system was not for them. And so the Ukrainian parliament met on August the 24th, 1991, and the parliament declared full independence of Ukraine, subject to a referendum. And here is another instance of democratic functioning. They held the referendum, and that was ratified by majorities in every oblast is a region, including in Crimea. And over 90% of voters in western and central Ukraine supported independence, while the average in eastern and southern oblasts was 85%. In Crimea, 54% of voters approved independence. So now we have Ukraine independent, but still operating under the old documents of the Soviets. So they needed a constitution. And at this point, what kind of structure of government were they going to have? Where was power going to lie? That was the issue. Presidents, the first two presidents, and I might mention they had to do this with no historical or contemporary experience whatsoever. And the first two presidents pushed for all governmental powers to be located in the office of the president, which is exactly what happened in most of the other countries that had made up the Soviet Union and were now independent. The president gets all the power. That top-down system that the Soviets were so good at. But Ukrainians didn't want that. They didn't want any part of that. So they were able to come to an agreement, the various parliamentary forces, to have first an interim constitution and then a permanent constitution, which avoided the president having all the powers. Now, we were there involved with some of this. We hosted a conference for the parliament on constitution making. And what had been going on is the current president had been arguing for centralizing power, and he gave examples, what he said were examples, that, for example, that Congress in the United States during the Great Depression suspended itself and gave all the power to the president. Not true. He had some other examples, too, in Chile and France. The French Parliament did not give all power to de Gaulle after World War II. So we had experts there who were experts in all of this, and the parliamentarians were very interested in this and had information about constitutions and their variations. And they pressed and were successful in not according all the power to the president. But that didn't end Ukraine's troubles. In 2004, that presidential election, Russian political and economic pressure and Russian intelligence misinformation activities were mounted in opposition to a Democratic candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, who was dedicated to bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union and European values. He was opposed by Viktor Yanukovych, who was the current incumbent president's candidate and supported by Russian activities. When the election was held, the exit poll showed that Yushchenko had won. But the Central Election Commission, which was under the thumb of the president, declared that Yanukovych had won. At which point, tens of thousands of Ukrainians poured into the streets in various Ukrainian cities to protest this and to call the fraud that it was. And this went on for weeks. For weeks. Finally, I think President Kuchma figured the jig was up. The Supreme Court declared the election certification void, and the Parliament then stepped up and passed a bill to provide for a repeat election. This became known, this then resulted in Yushchenko winning with 51.99% of the vote. And in these protests, the protesters were wearing orange garments, which is the reason I have this on. This is one of the stoles that they have representing the Orange Revolution. And that's what it's been known as ever since. So again, the autocrats tried to retain control, but the people won. Okay? But that, of course, was not the end of the crises. Yushchenko was elected all right, but the problem was that the Democratic forces did not carry through with the promised reforms. They were hobbled by all kinds of partisan infighting, which was really a shame. And so nothing really moved forward for change, which the Ukrainian people thought they had voted for. As a result, in the next election, Yanukovych, who had been defeated in the previous one, won. He promised stability. And so he came into office. And prior to the election, Ukraine had signed an agreement with the European Union to begin Ukraine moving into the process of applying for membership into the European Union. However, Russia put a lot of pressure on Yanukovych. And so he announced that he was suspending Ukraine's application for the European Union. At which point, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets in various Ukrainian cities to protest what was going on here. And they sustained those protests. And it got to the point where Yanukovych ordered the army and the security services to take down the protesters. And they fired on them. And hundreds of people were injured and many were killed in that, at which point the government lost all credibility with the populace. And Yanukovych saw that the handwriting was on the wall. So the European Union negotiated an agreement to provide for early elections and an interim government. And Yanukovych reluctantly agreed to that agreement. But he didn't stick around. He fled to Russia, where he still is. At which point, again, we have the parliament stepping up. It voted to remove him from office and to provide for an interim president, which was the current Speaker of the Parliament, and to provide for early elections. Again, a democratic result. Several crises, but then we come to the existing crisis, which is the Russian invasion. And again, the parliament and the government of Ukraine had to respond. So, how do they respond? Well, on the first day of the Russian invasion, the Parliament met at 6 o'clock in the morning in the basement of the Parliament building with 300 out of 423 deputies in attendance. They voted to impose martial law in the country with 299 in favor. Subsequently, the Parliament has renewed martial law every 90 days. Now, note this. In many countries, when there've been some kind of war or something like that, what has happened is the executive has imposed martial law, and there's no revision. In Ukraine, the people's representatives voted it, and they re-examine and renew every 90 days. The Parliament continued to meet and pass legislation even when Russian forces were closing on Kyiv. The session on March 14, 2022, for example, saw voting for 21 acts. Of those, 20 were voted positively by constitutional majorities of over 300 votes, which exhibits an overwhelming consensus among the factions, regardless of their previous political differences. And in fact, in the first year of the war, more than 1,700 draft laws were considered. So what we really saw here is the consolidation of political forces, which has been termed the coalition of defense. Some of the opposition parties, most notably European Solidarity, headed by the previous president, Poroshenko, who had been defeated in the previous election by Volodymyr Zelensky, announced a cessation of opposition to support the war effort. And what we've seen is attendance in the plenary sessions of the Parliament has continued to be very high, averaging 88%. So there are a number of things that the Parliament has had to do in terms of continuing to support the war effort, as you might guess. Let me get that here. And these are just some of the things. Obviously, martial law was the first one, and is a continuingly important one. But also things like providing for conscription, conditions for excusing people from the military, ratifying the agreement with NATO for NATO to support where it can. And this is just a small sample, because a lot of the legislation that Ukraine has had to consider have been to support industries, particularly war industries, but also other industries, to help the people adapt to war conditions. So they've been continually active on supporting the armed forces. But then they haven't stopped there. You know, one of the challenges, one of the large challenges that Ukraine faced and still faces to some extent since its independence is installing the rule of law and to fighting corruption. And that has been a major challenge to the democratic government. But during this war period, the Parliament has moved to pass major legislation to support the rule of law and have introduced new institutions and new laws to combat corruption. And in June of 2022, at the June European Council meeting, European Union leaders decided to grant Ukraine the status of a candidate country to join the EU. And this was the fastest action to act on an application for EU membership than any country has ever experienced. And And French President Emmanuel Macron stated during a press conference that the decision would not have been possible without the war in Ukraine and the fight of the people to, quote, defend our values, their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. And if you know anything about the EU accession process, it's very detailed, and particularly detailed on legal requirements, in various sectors, and in the overall judicial system and the police services and all of that. So they have teams that examine what countries are doing and what they're changing, which was done here, which makes the recognition by the European Union very significant in the progress that Ukraine has made in fighting corruption. The President of the European Council and the President of the European Commissioners issued a formal statement on February the 3rd, 2023, declaring, quote, the EU will support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people against Russia's ongoing war of aggression for as long as it takes. So the EU has reiterated its commitment to support Ukraine's bid for European integration. That's not to say that corruption has been eliminated. It hasn't, but they're working on it. And those efforts have been recognized by the European Union. But that's not all. The Parliament has also moved on economic reform. Coming out of a communist system, this is tough. Getting laws in place that support a market economy and to provide for fair treatment of all businesses is a huge issue in so many different sectors. And Ukraine has been working on that. What you see some of the examples here of the economic reforms that they have been working on. But just as one example, in the one area of food safety, by June 2022, 77 European Union legal acts had been fully passed by the Ukrainian parliament, and work was underway on another 60 economic reform laws. So what we see here is the parliament has continued to function during the war, and not only to support the war, but to reform major areas of Ukrainian society in cooperation with bodies like the European Union. So, in conclusion, the war has not stopped the operation of Ukraine's representative legislature. Ukraine's parliament has continued to pass legislation to support the war effort and to assist citizens and businesses to adapt to these difficult conditions. In addition, the war has served to speed up the adoption of reform legislation and to strengthen the rule of law. And in this effort, the opposition parties have combined with the president's party's majority in a coalition of defense to pass legislation to directly support the war effort, but also to advance reform legislation. Also, during the war, Parliament has sped up the adoption of legislation needed to qualify Ukraine to join the European Union. This has created, the war has actually created an incentive for Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, to meet the EU's requirements for accession. The Ukrainian government has viewed accession to the EU as part and parcel of Ukraine's war effort. And so they want to convince European governments and societies that Ukrainian democracy is advancing despite the war, and also supporting Ukraine so it prevails in the war, but also to lay the foundation for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is going to be a monumental effort after the destruction that Russia has caused. So these are the major things that have happened before and since the war. So I'll be happy to take your questions or comments. Yes, sir.
First of all, thanks for...
You'll wait just 1 second. So we are live streaming, and so that our audience there and all of you can hear better, if you'll wait till I bring you a mic, I'd really appreciate it.
First of all, thank you for helping Ukraine with their democracy. And I was just wondering your opinion on how you see things progressing from this point. I know they're trying to get a peace settlement there, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on the immediate future of Ukraine.
Well, sad to say, I don't think it's very close. The United States has asked the parties to declare a ceasefire. Ukraine has accepted that. Russia has not. And so where we go from here on that, I don't really know. Russia has said that there are preconditions, and those preconditions are essentially amount to Ukraine's surrender to Russia. That will not happen. Ukrainians are extremely protective of their country. They've had so much experience with Russian attacks. I mean, this war actually didn't start in 2022. It started when Russia marched into Crimea and took that, and then in 2014 when they marched into eastern Ukraine, and they're still there. I mean, they're expanding some of the lands they've taken. But, and President Putin has made it very clear that his objective is to erase Ukraine as an independent country. That is not acceptable for obvious reasons to Ukrainians, and it is not acceptable to most of the world. This idea that one country can eliminate another by force is kind of in opposition to everything that's been built up since World War II. So I wish I could be more optimistic that we're near a peace deal, but of course I'm not privy to what the negotiations are, but it doesn't look like to me that we're all that close. Yes, sir.
We hear of the billions and billions and billions of dollars for the United States.
Hold on, you know better.
We hear of the billions of dollars that the United States has poured into Ukraine to help their aid. Is Europe, the European nations, really pulling their weight? Are they helping as much?
More overall, if you take the whole contributions, and when you take both military and economic and governmental support together, it adds up to more than the United States at this point. Not to minimize at all what the United States has done, but many countries, and if you look at the recent reports, the European Union countries and other independent countries, including Norway and others that aren't members of the European Union, are actually increasing their support, monetary support for Ukraine.
Is Putin a lifetime dictator of his country?
Is he what?
A lifetime dictator of his country?
Well,
President?
I think the record demonstrates that. There's the international community has not recognized any of the elections, so-called elections, that have been held in Russia. No real candidates are allowed to oppose him. Navalny, who was one of the most well-known opponents and everything, died in a Russian prison. That seems to be the way. If you come forward as an opposition candidate, bad things will happen to you. That is kind of the opposite of the way things done are in democracies.
My last question. What's TAC mean on your scarf?
Yes to freedom. Yeah. Okay. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Is there anything that you would suggest that we do for our Ukrainian friends?
I'm glad you asked that. My colleague at the Worldwide Christian Support Task Force, Marianne Knuckles, has distributed note paper around here. If you would make a statement of support on those, these will be sent to people in Ukraine. It's very important for people in Ukraine to know that people in the United States and in the West are with them and are thinking about them and their plight. You can imagine the feeling of isolation they must have when they're under assault every day from Russian missiles and the rest of it. So if you would take just a couple of minutes or a minute to write a note, we will see that they get to the people of Ukraine.
Charles, do you have a particular message that you want to be included on these cards?
That we are thinking of them and we support them in their bid for freedom. And we're praying for them. Yes, thank you. Marianne?
Historically, the people who work in the field in countries that are experiencing persecution and assault of one kind or another have arrived at the point of saying that the number one most important thing that we can do is pray. And to let these people know that we are praying for them, because they have such a feeling of isolation in the situation that they're in. They don't have feedback in terms of the rest of the world. And if they know that someone somewhere is praying for them and is feeling supportive toward them, it buoys their spirits. It keeps them fighting the battles that they're fighting and keeps them moving. So if you are so inclined to say that our prayers are with you, that's good. And if you'll just leave them on the seat, I'll go through and sort out what's blank cards and what has writing on them.
We'd like to call your attention to the fact that Ukraine is not the only place under assault. Christians, and let me say this, Ukraine is not being assaulted just because they're Christians, but the way the Russians treat Christians in the areas they control is on a par with persecution we've seen in every country in the world. If you're not a member of the Russian Orthodox Church and you're in eastern Ukraine, if you're a Methodist, for example, or a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, or a member of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, then you can expect to be under surveillance and for churches to be closed, which has happened, and for priests to be apprehended. And what the Russian authorities say is that all these churches are agents of the United States, that they're engaged in intelligence and sabotage of the Russian authorities. It's not true, of course, but that's what they say, and that's why they persecute any member who's not a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has formally, by its head, endorsed the war. So that is one of the regrettable circumstances that Christians are living under in eastern Ukraine. And we would like to offer you materials about Christian persecution and what is being done about it. On the narthex on the table going out, there are a number of materials about Christian persecution, and I have some here too. You're welcome to take them, including the World Watch List for 2025 that is put out by Open Doors USA, which monitors countries around the world and how they are treating Christians and persecution. And this booklet talks about the 50 top persecutors in the world and what is happening there. So we'd invite you to take one of those and to become cognizant of what's really happening around the world.
Could you briefly describe the symbols on the table?
Sure.
Charles, I'm going to give you a mic. We're having
Oh,
a
yeah,
hard
I'm
time
sorry.
hearing you. No, you're fine.
Yeah, thank you. These are from the Transcarpathia, the area in western Ukraine in the Carpathian Mountains. This is the particular style that you'd find in the Carpathian Mountains. This is a matrushka. You may be familiar with Russian petrushka. Let me assure you, this is a Ukrainian petrushka with Ukrainian symbols on it. It was given to me by the deputy chairman of the Ukrainian parliament. So that's what's happening here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here today and educating us. I'm wondering what kind of support Zelensky still has. What is your sense of that he's been in office now 5 to 6 years?
Right.
Are the people behind him? Are there any opposition candidates for whatever reason?
Yeah, the polls I've seen is that he's still overwhelmingly supported by the people. It's come down some, which you might expect after this many years of war, but I think he still has very large support in the country. As I was indicating earlier, well, first of all, the Ukrainian Constitution provides that when Ukraine is under martial law, elections are suspended. That goes for president and for the parliament. Now, the parliament, as I said before, the parliament renews martial law every 90 days, excuse me, every 90 days. So if they saw an opportunity and a need for the elections, then they could just not renew martial law and then there would be elections. But the law provides that members of the government, the parliament and whatever, cannot be removed during martial law. And the rationale for that is that the country is under occupation and under assault in various areas, as you know. I mean, in conditions of war, there's the question, well, how would you organize an election? Now, you can bet, at least I would bet, that if they tried to organize an election, that you'd see Russian drones over the election venues. So you can understand why they are reluctant to do that. In the meantime, Zelensky's party, which still has a majority in the parliament, and the opposition parties are working together. And not to say that there are not differences of opinion, but I don't know of any strong movement to try to upset that situation at this point. Yes, sir.
I know that the United States accepted a large number of women and children from the Ukraine, and my understanding now is that there's some talk of not allowing them to stay in the United States. You know any reasoning behind that?
I haven't heard anything more recent about it, no. I think it's part of, from what I understand, part of the administration's efforts to repeal the status of people in various categories that are here under various provisions. But I haven't got any more recent update than that.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Oh, yeah, I'll get my steps in. There you go.
There has been one incident reported in the news where a Ukrainian student who was a Fulbright scholar was arrested and detained, but apparently the courts have knocked that one back. And Julie, who is sitting in the second row, and I would have some concerns about that, and many of you would also, because a couple of years ago we had a Fulbright scholar named Alana who came here, and we did some fundraising and a dinner for her and so on, and she's in that situation of being a Fulbright scholar here on student visa and so on. So this is a real concern all the way around, and it does, we think it's way over there and it doesn't touch our lives, but it does.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Mary, I think Mary.
Well, thank you.
I have two more quickies. I know that some of you belong to other groups outside of St. Mark's. If any of the groups that you're involved in are interested in writing letters to Ukrainian citizens, you are more than welcome to collect those, bring them into the office. If you can't remember Worldwide Christian Support, which is a mouthful of a title, it's on the bottom row of the boxes, or give them to someone in the office and they'll put them in the box, and I will see to it that they get delivered, whether they're from St. Mark's or not. And it may not go out on the immediate one. It may sit there for a few weeks or a month or whatever until we get ready to send another shipment out. But I will be more than glad to accept letters and notes from anybody else who cares to write them. And I don't remember what the second thing was, so goodbye.
All right, anything else? Well,
Methodist Church helping in fundraising for Ukraine?
so John's question, is the Methodist Church helping in fundraising for the Ukraine? I don't have the answer for that.
I went online, and I think they're, as part of UNCOR, I think
There could be a piece of it.
we got a head nod.
I think that via UMCOR for relief.
Okay, so UMCOR, our organization for relief, has a piece of that program then. Okay. Others? Well, Charles, thank you again
Well,
for
thank you all
being
for
here,
coming.
and please,
Appreciate
thank you. Please feel free to take those materials here, and there's a lot of materials on the table in the narthex so that you have even more information. And thank you for being here with us today. Oh, she remembered.
If you're interested in more information, just hit the internet. If you're interested specifically in Christian persecution, type in Russian persecution of Christians, and you'll get all kinds of stories of them taxing the churches out of business and confiscating property and arresting priests and all kinds of things that are just not real pleasant.
All right, thank you again.